Hello, everyone, and warm welcome to today's Godhead Live conversation. My name is Taina Maaria Jara, and I am your host on this channel. And today I have the joy of welcoming my Finnish sister in Christ, Paula Saari, to share her testimony of how she was led to finding her calling with God and how the Lord is using her mightily for his kingdom. And today is really a special day for me. I have had over 100 interviews on this channel, and today I have the first person from Finland. Thank you for coming, Paula, and sharing your testimony.
Amen. Taina, thank you so much. I'm excited. I'm privileged to share here. Thank you so much.
Please share us first how and when you got saved by Jesus and gave your life to him and accepted him as your Lord and Savior.
Yes, that is my greatest privilege to do that. So 13 years ago, actually, I was studying in Tampere in a university. And I was about to finish my studies. I was doing a master degree there. And I was in a summer job. And there was a young lady around 25 years old, and she was a believer, filled with the Holy Spirit. And I didn't know about that, but she noticed that I was actually searching for God. And she noticed that I was speaking about, why do they do so much bad things in the name of religion nowadays in different nations? And she told me about Jesus. Basically, we met in a coffee. We went to coffee, and she told me that, hey, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And she even showed me from the piece of paper that, hey, there is God, and it's like Heavenly Father, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and the Holy Spirit. And she tried to explain it to me. And in the end of our conversation, she brought me to a local Pentecostal youth service where I encountered Jesus for the very first time in my life. So when I enter in to the church, I didn't hear any voices, but I just knew that it was God who was speaking inside of me. And he told me, I'm your real father. I have always loved you. I have created you in your mother's womb. I know everything about you. And my friend showed me the empty sanctuary, and there was a golden letters written, Jesus. And I knew exactly that Jesus Christ has also took the punishment for my sins on the cross. And my friend asked me, do you want to give your life to Jesus? And I was so shocked about that question, because I felt that it was the most radical question that I have ever heard. Inside of me, I was thinking about, oh, this is too radical. But then I was crushed down in the power of the Holy Spirit. I didn't know that it was the Holy Spirit, but I started crying and just really surrendering. I said, yes, I want to give my life to Jesus. And after that, it has been just following Jesus in his marvelous plan. So that happened to me, and my life changed exactly 13 years ago. Praise God. You see, Taina, I didn't know about Jesus, even though many people think that Finland is a Christian nation. But actually, I haven't never heard about anybody stopping me in the streets or, sharing to me in my workplace about Jesus, that actually Jesus is the way. We heard about many things about God, about the Father God. And even when I was 15 years old, I was in a confirmation camp. And I knew in my heart, inside of me, that I was looking of a relationship with God. But actually, I didn't realize that I need to give my life to Jesus. And I need to realize that I have sinned and fallen short from the glory of God, and only Jesus can save me. So that's the core message that really hit me, and my life was totally transformed that day. And even that same night, there was a young people praying in tongues inside of that church. And I heard that praying in tongues for the very first time. And immediately when I heard the praying of tongues, it's just rise inside of me that, hey, Father, Jesus, I want to also pray in tongues. So I got filled with the Holy Spirit the same night and started to speak in tongues the next morning. So that was really supernatural.
The enemy has done this job of trying to hide and cover up the name that is above every name, that is Jesus Christ. And then, people, I'm coming from New Age myself, so you hear about God or gods, and you even hear about Jesus, but it is not the right message. I am the truth, I am the way, and I am the life, he said, and he still is.
Exactly.
So let's move on now into your main testimony. You were feeling empty and didn't really know where you belonged and what was your real purpose in life.
Thank you. This is very important question, and it is very important topic, because Jesus has not just saved us, he has also called us within a holy calling. So if somebody is holy, it's separated from the world. So it's not according to our plans, it's according to God's plans. So by the time when I born again in Tampere, I supernaturally found Christian TV channel from my television. By that time, I was still watching some things from the television, and there was believers, and they were talking about this calling that, hey, God is calling you to his purpose and for the holy calling. And I was alone in my home, and I was praying again, like I was kneeling in my home, that, hey, now Jesus, you have saved me. I remember that I have been saved for just some weeks, and I was praying in my own home that, hey, Jesus, I need to know for sure 100% what you have called me to do. You see, I was just graduated from the university. I had a master degree. Everything was open for me, in a sense, that what is the next step? So I decided I'm going to go alone in the middle of the nature, and I'm going to pray until I know that I know that I know. And many times God is speaking, especially for me, in nature. So I started to walk. Actually, the place is called Pyynikki. It's a place in Tampere, and I walked there, and I went to a lonely place, and I started to pray, praying tongues, and really just praying and praying. I didn't hear anything, I didn't feel anything, and I had this thought that maybe I was praying around half an hour or something, but it seems to me that it's like a long time. I was just born again. I was a baby Christian. And I thought that, okay, God is not going to speak to me. So maybe I just go home, and just very, very little, I don't know, maybe it wasn't even seconds in time before this thought came into my mind. I just know that I know that I know that I heard that God was speaking to me. Mark 16:15, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And that was just the word of God. So simple
Wow.
it is. And I don't even, I probably didn't even know where is that in the Bible. And I was happy that I knew that God was speaking to me. But then at the same time, I was thinking about, oh, it doesn't sound very glamorous. What does this mean? And I continue walking to my home, and I heard in the inward witness, inside of me, that small voice, gentle voice of the Holy Spirit speaking, and these signs shall follow those who believe in my name. They will heal the sick. They will cast out demons. If they drink any poison, it will not harm them. You know, they will lay hands on the sick and they will be healed. And I could see in my spirit, I didn't see like a physical vision, but I saw in my spirit masses of people getting healed, delivered, saved. And I just knew that Jesus was speaking to me, that the preaching of the gospel will start from the streets in Finland and then to the nations of the world in the right time. When years went by, I noticed that I started to join the street evangelism groups together with the church. And then I went to the Bible school for 3 years. And after the Bible school, the Lord opened up for me supernaturally to go to Orlando, Florida, to a training with the organization called Christ for All Nations, which is a ministry started late evangelist Reinhard Ponke, nowadays led by Daniel Kolenda. And through that 3-month training, the nations opened. And now today I have been traveling different nations in the continent of Africa, Zambia, Ghana, Nigeria. I just came from Nigeria last Tuesday, India, and I have also training other peoples as well. People who are called to be an evangelist or missionaries in Germany, Finland. So this has been my calling, especially for the last 3 years, full time. So it's exciting.
I have seen these videos and images of you on Facebook, you know, in front of these huge masses of people, and how you are sharing the gospel with them. And have you experienced lots of healings and miracles, exactly what the Lord has promised?
Yes, that's right. And many years I kept that inside of me. I kind of was focusing on just serving in the church because I knew that it was not the right timing. Even in 2017, I was participating in some other ministry, and we went to the Brazil, and we went to the poorest areas where people were living, and I was joining there, even did an altar call. I remember I did an altar call, and all the people came to the front, give their life to Jesus. And also there was one man who have been deaf for 40 years. We didn't share the same language because he didn't speak English. And he waved at me somewhere there that pray for me, pray for me. I went to him, I started to pray. I pray in English, I pray in Finnish, I pray in heavenly language. I didn't know what was wrong. And I just declare the healing and the blood of Jesus over him. And half an hour from that prayer, the team leader, who also is a Brazilian man, he came to talk to me that this man testified that he has been deaf for 40 years and now he started to hear. So those were the moments when I really started to pray about that. Is there something more? You know, I started to have that hunger about missions and evangelism and the work of an evangelist. But when I came to Finland, the church where I was part of invited me to share a message and a testimony about this mission trip. I shared, but I knew inside of me, I was not ready. I just knew that there were things in my life that I was not ready for it. And I felt that Lord was calling me to a preparation time, for a specific preparation time in the Word of God and in the Holy Spirit. And not many months from that point, I started a very intense period of my life, 3 years in River Bible Institute in Finland, Helsinki, and that during those years in the Bible school, Lord did a really big work inside of me. So it started ministry of helps and serving in kids' church as an usher, organizing outreaches, meetings in the cities of Finland. So it didn't look like an international evangelist, and it was not, but those were the really important days where the Holy Spirit was teaching to me about his word, about the holiness, about the character. I highly recommend everybody who has a call of God in their lives that if they have not yet done a Bible school, that they would pray in the Holy Ghost to prepare themselves, because this kind of a calling, there's a lot of things happening and the enemy is not playing a fair game. So you need to be ready for the task that the Lord has called for you. So
how to recognize where our place and position is in each season of our life, and also understand the patience and waiting upon the Lord and his guidance.
First of all, the call of God, it comes from God. You know, Jesus calls and we follow. So in ourselves, even as a Christians, even as a born again believers, we might have thoughts, we might have plans that are not from the Holy Ghost. So you need to ask from Jesus. You need to ask if you don't know. I have heard so many times believers talking to me that I don't know my calling. I don't know whether I'm one of the fivefold ministries or what am I called to do. But Holy Spirit knows. So if you being led by the Holy Spirit, you don't have to worry about that. What am I called to do and how exactly it's going to look like? Because most of the time you don't know what's gonna come. You know, Holy Spirit is like a wind. It blows. You don't know where it comes and where it goes. But if you submit to the process and you know you have an inward witness, like me, I had an inward witness that the Bible verse, the word from the Lord that I received was from him, and it was according to his plans. Gospel, the Great Commission, it's definitely in the core of Father, and that's why he sent Jesus, and Jesus gave this commission to us. So how is it going to look like? We don't always know, but I believe when you pray in the Holy Spirit and you listen what the Holy Spirit is telling you, and then you will have a word from the Lord, and then you have an inward witness. So that's the starting point of God's calling. And sometimes he might ask you to go to Bible school or do something. Maybe it might look like he might ask you to help somebody. He might ask you to help some minister, even, because most likely you don't start there where you have like, you might have a vision and the dreams from the Lord, but it's not that the next day you will be there. So he will equip you wherever he's called you to do. He will equip you, but in that process you will have a protection from the Holy Spirit. You will have a provision from the Holy Spirit. You will have a willingness to submit to the process, which is so important, because many times God is preparing people in a secret place. So it
Mm.
might be that the other people don't understand it. Other people don't might realize it, like why are you doing this, or why are you helping this person, or some of my friends told me, because I was already 30 years old when I went to the Bible school, that why are you going there to help in kids church? You know that you are called to be an evangelist. Why are you doing this? But I knew exactly that I was in the right place and doing the right things. And I had a grace for that, because it was time to get immersed in the Word of God. It was my time to be built up inside of it. So, in the end of the day, it doesn't even matter what you are doing, because God sees what He is doing inside of you. The most important thing is to have a really close relationship with Jesus. And when you are there having that close relationship with Jesus, he can do anything. He can send you anywhere. Even during the time when I went to Orlando, Florida, it was COVID-19, and there was restrictions, and some of the people said to me that, I mean, how is it possible? It's not possible to enter into the US. But I just knew, Lord made a way for me, and
Amen,
that was the
amen.
right time, because His timing is not about the things that are like natural things. We know we all have a natural man and a spiritual man. So we need to let that spiritual man inside of us be bigger inside, that we can be led by the Spirit. And being led by the Spirit is not being led by emotions. Sometimes
Mm.
Lord is calling us to leave things, leave your provision, leave your work, or move to another city, move to another nation, or leave things behind you, even relationships, and your emotions might be involved. But being led by the Holy Spirit is not being led by emotions, even though we go through things. It's really important to ask from God in prayer, because He knows better than you know. At
Absolutely.
least for these important things in your life, the calling, what you should do here on this earth as a follower of Jesus Christ, or uh, who should I marry? Holy Spirit knows better. So of course God respect our own will, but still He knows better. So there's a wisdom to ask the one who knows.
Mm.
And then the peace of God will surround you. These seasons, you just know you have that peace of God. Even if you are doing something very original, people might think this looks very original. Why don't you do like this? Why don't you go there? There's an open door. There's an opportunity. But it might be that Holy Spirit wants to do something else in that season in your life.
Yes.
So that's why, even for now, um, people might ask, when is your next mission trip, or what are you going to do next, or what's going to happen next? So I'm like, oh, let the Holy Spirit lead. Sometimes I say, I have these things in my calendar I can share, but I'm still led by the Holy Spirit. If He asks me to stay somewhere, if He asks me to do something else, I obey, because it's His will. And that's the most wonderful place to be.
The Holy Spirit, He's doing work inside of us. He's transforming us. He's even changing our tastes and preferences. So, in that way, he's also molding us so that our will becomes closer and closer to his will. And my prayer is also like make your will my desire, so that there is less and less conflict of interest between my will and his will. And what you were saying, Paula, I was having these Bible scriptures in my mind all the time. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts, and my ways are not your ways. My ways are higher than your ways. Would you like to talk to the topic of faith on your journey?
Definitely. So faith is such a vital part in the calling of God. I believe in many believers' life, because I was also in a university, so I need to kind of relearn away from that thinking like we're supposed to be very critical and analytical. So faith is a journey. It's a journey where I kind of felt that Jesus always wants to bring us higher. Just like in that Bible verse where you were saying that his ways are so much higher than our ways or our plans. So where he wants to lead us, it's so much higher. It's in a sense bigger than what we are thinking. It's better because his calling is not boring. It's not ordinary. It doesn't look natural thing. It's a supernatural thing. Holy calling is a supernatural thing, even though only Jesus can open the blind eyes, only Jesus can open the deaf ears, only Jesus can raise the dead, and only Jesus can do the supernatural things in your life. So you need to, during that process where he's calling you, for example, in my life, he has been teaching me about keep on saying yes. So he speaks to me or something about some nation or something, and then he only waits for me to say yes. And many times it has to do with finances, health, natural conditions. They are not always perfect. But what I can testify from myself, because some people have asked me that, how is it possible to live like that? And how do you have the finances to travel so much and things like that? So then the faith aspect jumps in. So you need to realize that, yes, there is a practical side of things, and he might give you a plan how to do and build certain things that they are possible, but also a faith aspect that really you need to let him speak to you about how big plans he's got, and how he can open up the doors. And I've noticed that when you go forward, it's sometimes God is asking you to take a step of faith, and it really feels that in your flesh you're like kind of you almost like it's your flesh is screaming. But when you go through these processes, your faith muscle, it's like a muscle that it grows. And then the next time, it's more easier for you to take those steps of faith. And it's really important also, of course, the word of God, but also to be connected to the people who have more faith than you have. Or you can listen to sermons about these people who have been taking the steps of faith during their journey, in their ministry, in their callings. Everything takes faith. You need to trust the process, that wherever he's calling, he's not going to let you down.
Because in God's kingdom, every great thing that we humans have done is through Jesus and his greatness. Because without him, we can do nothing, right?
Submit to his will is the key part, that we would be connected to him, to have a really close relationship with Jesus, and also that we would be yielded to his will. And I must admit, I'm in that same process all the time. I mean, every day is a new day, and opportunity to be more yielded to his will wherever we are. Are we listening those small, gentle voices of the Holy Spirit when he's asking us to do something? It might be very, very important for someone else's life, because what I have noticed, the little things that I have noticed during these years, is that Jesus always sent you and give you something, whether it's spiritual gifts like gifts of the Holy Spirit, or fills you with his Holy Spirit, or you get a touch from Jesus. It might be in a revival conference, or somehow you get a revelation. There's a purpose, and that's for the people. That's for serving for people. Freely we have received, freely give. In the heart of God, the giving is the most important thing, because he wants us to share it to the lost and dying world. Or sometimes I have noticed that, of course, gospel, we steward things. So, for example, he has give us gospel, so we should steward it, we should share it. And also he has give us talents, different kind of gifts, finances, prayers. So it's always for other people. It's always when he touches you and when he gives you, he wants you to multiply it to other people. It's just that when he comes bigger inside of you, and when he is doing a big work inside of you, he can do it through you. So those are the things when I said that those people who have done great things in the kingdom of God. So it shows us that Jesus has first done a big work inside of them, so he can do it through them. Christ in us, the hope of glory. Like Apostle Paul says, it's not longer me who lives, but Christ in me. And then you go to that place where you want to give all glory to Jesus. Your failures, or your everything what you have done in the kingdom of God, the great things, all the glory and the honor goes to Jesus, because he's the one. In the end of the day, it's all about Jesus, and Jesus coming big inside of us. So that's the most wonderful and most beautiful thing, when people see your passion for the Lord.
And often that passion comes also from trials, right? We are also
Absolutely.
trialed, and that is how we grow in our faith and in our faithfulness as well.
Yes, I really feel that there's a lot of people who are watching this, and maybe they are thinking in themselves that how can I ever fulfill the goal of God, or look about my abilities. So I just want to really encourage that it's not about your abilities or your natural capable of doing things. I want to encourage you that step out boldly when the Holy Spirit is speaking to you. Step out boldly, obey. He can do it. He has a plan and a purpose and a calling for your life. Actually, Bible says that all things are possible to those who believe. So don't compare yourself to the other people, because God has a very, very unique calling for your life. And it looks just the way he has planned it that to look like. And it's going to be wonderful. It's going to be special, because Holy Spirit is always leading you forward. It's always lifting you up. It's always helping you, encouraging you, and take that step of faith, So don't postpone it. If he's calling you to do something, don't postpone it. Jump on it, and you will do great together with Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Especially now, we are called more and more to step up and out into His will and let Him use us for His purpose. And through that, we found this fulfillment in life that nobody else can give us. And thank you, Paula, for coming. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Also, check out Paula's ministry website in the video description. Blessings, everyone, and I will see you again next week.